9 years into my marriage, I found out my husband had a daughter because an elementary school nurse called the wrong number. It was 2:43 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a conference room at work halfway through a presentation when my phone buzzed 3 times in a row. I ignored the first call. I ignored the second one too. On the third call, the person left a voicemail. I planned to listen to it after the meeting. Then I saw the automatic transcript on my screen. "Mrs. Monroe, we still can't reach your husband." Mia fell from the playground equipment. "Please call the school nurse immediately." I stared at those words for at least 10 seconds. My husband's name was Caleb Monroe, but I didn't know any child named Mia. And more importantly, Caleb and I didn't have children. My name is Evelyn Monroe. I was 34. Caleb was 37. We had been married for 9 years. For the first few years, we seriously talked about having a baby. Then life got in the way, work, the mortgage, and one very early miscarriage that I never really got over. After that, the conversation kept getting pushed further into the future. Caleb always had a reason. "Let's wait until I get promoted. Let's get a little more financially stable. Let's wait until I'm not traveling so much." I understood. Again and again, I understood. So when the nurse said your husband's daughter, cheating wasn't even my first thought. I assumed someone had entered the wrong phone number. Maybe Caleb was an emergency contact for a friend's child. Maybe the girl didn't have a father around. Maybe he was helping someone. Caleb was good at helping people. At least that was who I had always believed he was. I stepped out of the conference room and called the school. "Hi. I just received a message from your nurse." The woman asked for my name. "Evelyn Monroe." There was a pause. Then her tone changed. "You're Mr. Caleb Monroe's wife?" "Yes, and you're Mia's." She stopped. "I'm not anything to Mia." Another silence. I could hear a child crying somewhere behind her. Then the nurse lowered her voice. "There may be an error in the emergency contact information." "I'm sorry, I'll contact her mother." I was about to hang up when she asked one more question. "Is Mr. Monroe out of town today?" "Yes." "He flew to Denver yesterday for work." The nurse didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I see." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. "Why are you asking?" "It's nothing. He's usually very easy to reach." My fingers tightened around my phone. "What does that mean?" "Does he come to the school often?" The nurse immediately realized she had said too much. "Mrs. Monroe, I think it would be best if you spoke directly with your family." Then she politely ended the call. I stood alone in the office hallway. The air conditioning was freezing, but my palms were sweating. Caleb had left the night before around 7. He had pulled his suitcase through the kitchen. He wore his gray coat. Before leaving, he opened the refrigerator and asked me if we had enough milk. I said yes. He said he would be home Friday. It was Tuesday. He told me he was attending a regional sales meeting in Denver. I even knew the name of the hotel. The night before, around 11, I had texted him, "Did you land?" 30 minutes later, he replied, "Yeah, exhausted. Talk tomorrow." That was it. Normal. So normal that I had never questioned it. I went back into my office. The meeting was still going. One of my coworkers asked if something was wrong. Just a family thing. Then I picked up my bag. For once, I didn't explain anything else. I drove straight to the elementary school. It was about 25 minutes from my office, but only 10 minutes from our house. That distance bothered me the entire drive. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Caleb was probably helping a friend. Maybe this was a coworker's daughter. Maybe the child's father wasn't around. Maybe he had agreed to be her emergency contact. Caleb had always been the kind of person people relied on. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. We met when I was 25 and he was 28. At a friend's party, a waiter dropped a tray full of glasses. Everybody else kept talking. Caleb crouched down and started helping him pick up the broken glass. Later, I asked him why he bothered. He shrugged. Somebody has to. I loved that answer. Years later, I would realize something. Some people are very good at taking care of everyone else's problems. That doesn't mean they know how to take responsibility for their own life. I got to the school at 3:20. A little girl was sitting outside the nurse's office, light brown hair, a large bandage over one knee, a pink water bottle held between both hands. I walked past her at first, then she looked up at me. She stared at my face for maybe 2 seconds. Then she turned toward the nurse. "Is Daddy coming?" I stopped walking. The nurse saw me and immediately looked uncomfortable. I pointed toward the child. That's Mia? The little girl looked at me too. She appeared to be about 6 years old, big eyes, and on the left side of her face, near the corner of her mouth, was a small dimple. Caleb had the same dimple. I used to love it. One of my favorite wedding photos was a picture of him laughing, that little dimple showing clearly. I stood there realizing that sometimes a person's face can become evidence. The nurse came over. Mrs. Monroe, we've reached Mia's mother. She's on her way. What about Caleb? We still haven't reached him. Is he her father? I asked it directly. The nurse clearly didn't know what to say, but the little girl answered for her. He's my dad. She said it casually, proudly even. Then she pointed to a photo board on the wall. My daddy came to dad breakfast last month. I followed her finger. The board was filled with photos from school events. Third row, near the right side, Caleb. He was wearing a navy sweater I had bought him. Mia stood beside him. They were holding paper plate suns they had made together. There was a date printed underneath, March 14th. I remembered March 14th. It was the day my mother had eye surgery. Caleb told me he had to fly to Atlanta because a client contract had fallen apart. He had left home before 5 that morning. I drove my mother to the hospital alone. After surgery, she kept asking me, why couldn't Caleb come? And I defended him. He really couldn't get away. Apparently he could. He just didn't come with me. I took out my phone and photographed the picture. My hand was shaking badly, but I still wasn't crying. About 10 minutes later, a woman rushed into the office. Mid-30s, golden brown hair, beige trench coat. The first thing she did was crouch down and hug Mia. Baby mom's here. Mia immediately started telling her how she had fallen. The woman hugged her and checked her knee. Then she looked up and saw me. Her expression slowly changed. She didn't look at me like a stranger, and she didn't look completely shocked either. She recognized me. I knew right then that this was going to be worse than I thought. She stood. You're Evelyn. Not. Who are you? She said my name. You know me. She didn't answer. Who are you? Megan. Megan Parker. She clearly wanted to get Mia out of the room before we continued. She asked the nurse to take Mia to get another ice pack. After the child left, Megan stood there silently for a long moment. Finally, she asked, Caleb never told you? I actually laughed. What do you think? Her face went pale. Then she asked something I never expected. Aren't you two separated? I stared at her. What? Caleb said you've been separated for 3 years. He said you never officially divorced because of the house, the mortgage, and some tax issues. For a moment, I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone instead. I found a photo from the previous night. Caleb was sitting in our kitchen, eating the pasta I had made while packing for his trip. I had taken the picture because he spilled sauce on his shirt. I turned the screen toward Megan. This was last night. She looked at it. The color drained from her face. He left our home last night for his so-called trip to Denver. He told me he'll be back Friday. His wedding ring is still on his hand. His clothes are still in our closet. His toothbrush is still next to mine. We file taxes jointly, so no. We are not separated. Megan grabbed the edge of the desk. I looked at her. I should have hated her, at least. That's what movies teach you. This is the part where the wife and the other woman start screaming at each other. But the look on Megan's face was the exact same look I had worn when I saw that school picture. She didn't look like a winner. She looked like a woman who had just realized her life might be fake too. How old is Mia? 6. Is she Caleb's biological daughter? Megan closed her eyes. Yes, my ears started ringing. 6. Caleb and I had been married for 9 years. This wasn't recent. This had been happening through most of our marriage. When did you meet him? 7 years ago. You knew he was married? Yes. She didn't avoid the question. For some reason that made me calmer. I know how bad that sounds. He told me he was married from the beginning, but he said you weren't really husband and wife anymore. He said you slept in separate rooms? He said you didn't want children. My head snapped up. He said what? Megan froze. He said, you didn't want kids. I felt my whole body go still. The reason Caleb and I didn't have children wasn't because I didn't want them. It was almost the opposite. I had wanted a baby badly. After my miscarriage, I cried secretly in the bathroom for months. Caleb held me. He told me, we still have time. A year later, he started saying work was too busy. Another year later, he said maybe we should enjoy life as a couple. Every time I brought up trying again, he would ask, why do we need a baby so badly? Eventually, I thought we had made that decision together. Now I knew the truth. While he was convincing me to let go of motherhood, another little girl was already calling him Daddy. Did you know we lost a baby? Megan's eyes immediately filled with tears. What? During our second year of marriage, I got pregnant. I lost the pregnancy before 9 weeks. Caleb knew. She covered her mouth. I stopped talking. I didn't want to do this in front of a child. The nurse brought Mia back. Megan asked me quietly, "Do you want to meet somewhere else and talk?" "Not today." She nodded. Before I left, I looked at Mia. She smiled politely. "Bye. Bye, sweetheart." I walked out of the school and got into my car. Then I realized I had no idea where I wanted to go home. Back to work? Go find Caleb? I did none of those things. I sat in the parking lot and called my husband. First call, no answer. Second call, no answer. Third call, finally he picked up. The background was quiet. No airport, no meeting room, no Denver hotel. What is it? He even sounded slightly annoyed. I looked at the school entrance. "How's the weather in Denver?" He paused for a second. "Fine. Is it raining?" "No." I closed my eyes. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" I just met Mia. The silence on the other end lasted a long time. Long enough for me to hear his breathing change. Then he said, "Evelyn, go home." I laughed. "Where are you?" "I'll explain. Where are you?" Another pause. Finally, "I'm still in town." I closed my eyes. So there had never been a Denver trip. "Where were you today?" "I had something to take care of." "Was it about Mia?" "Evelyn, answer me." "Yes." I hung up. He called back. I didn't answer. Less than 40 minutes later, Caleb walked through our front door. He didn't even have his suitcase, which was almost funny. A man who was supposed to be hundreds of miles away had somehow made it home in 40 minutes. I was sitting at the kitchen table. No dramatic evidence display. No bottle of wine. No tears. Just a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He sat across from me. "I know you're probably. Is Mia your daughter?" "Yes." "Did you do a DNA test?" "Yes." "She's 6? "Yes." "When did you and Megan start?" He looked down. 7 years ago. I did the math. 2 years into our marriage. Has it continued this whole time? He didn't answer directly. That was my answer. "Do you love her?" He finally looked at me. "It's more complicated than you think." I almost laughed. People who get caught always seem to love that sentence. It's complicated. The strange thing is, the facts are usually very simple. He lied. For years. "You told her we've been separated for 3 years?" Yes or no? "Yes, you told her I didn't want children?" He went silent. Something inside me that had always looked for excuses on his behalf finally disappeared. "Why would you say that? Things were complicated." "What things?" "When Megan got pregnant, she was scared. She didn't want to raise a child alone, so you told her I didn't want kids?" "I just wanted her to feel like—" He stopped. I finished the sentence. "Like she wasn't the woman destroying someone else's marriage. Like eventually you would choose her." Caleb rubbed both hands over his face. "I never wanted to hurt you. For the first time, those words sounded almost ridiculous. You lied for 7 years. But you didn't want to hurt me?" Then he started talking about Mia. About how innocent she was. About how scared he had been the first time he held her. About how he couldn't abandon a newborn child. "I never asked why you didn't leave her. I'm asking why you didn't leave me." He froze. That was the real question. If 7 years earlier he had come home and told me, "I cheated. She's pregnant. The baby is mine," it would have destroyed me. I probably would have fallen apart. But at least I would have had a choice. I could stay. I could leave. I could scream. I could forgive him. At least it would have been my life. But Caleb didn't give me that choice. He decided for me that I didn't need to know. I continued being his wife. Megan continued waiting. Mia continued calling him Dad, and Caleb moved between both households according to whatever schedule worked best for him. "How many of your business trips were real?" He looked away. "A lot of them." I noticed something about the way Caleb answered questions. You could ask him 10 things. He would give you 4 honest answers. Then expect those 4 to prove the other 6 were true too. I stopped asking. "You need to stay somewhere else tonight." His head snapped up. "Evelyn, go. We've been married 9 years, I know. Then at least give me a chance to explain everything. I looked at him. Haven't 7 years been enough time to come up with an explanation? He had nothing to say. That night, Caleb stayed at a hotel. I was alone in our house. Strangely, I didn't immediately fall apart. The first thing I did was something completely ordinary. I changed the sheets. I don't know why. Maybe I suddenly couldn't stand sleeping where he had slept the night before. Around 1 in the morning I still couldn't sleep. So I opened my laptop. Caleb had always handled our mortgage, insurance, and larger household payments. Not because I couldn't understand them. He just liked doing it, and I had gotten used to letting him. We bought our townhouse during our 3rd year of marriage. Both of our names were on the deed. We refinanced once about 6 years earlier. Then, 3 years ago, Caleb said interest rates were good and suggested opening a home equity line of credit, a HELOC. Just in case. If the roof needs major work, if your mom ever has medical expenses, if we decide to renovate, I agreed. As far as I knew, we had barely touched it. When I logged into the account and saw the balance, I thought I was reading it wrong. $84,000 had been withdrawn. Less than $10,000 remained available. I stared at the screen. Then I opened the transaction history. The first withdrawal was 2 years and 8 months earlier, $45,000, then $19,000, then several smaller withdrawals. The descriptions were vague. Property services, home improvement, legal costs. I had no idea where the money had gone. At 1:48 in the morning, I texted Caleb, "Where did the $84,000 from our HELOC go?" No answer. At 2:07, my phone finally lit up. "Let's talk tomorrow." Those 3 words woke me up completely. I didn't wait for tomorrow. The next morning, I took the day off and went to the bank. A manager pulled the documents. At some point, the credit limit had been increased, which required renewed authorization from both homeowners. The manager turned the screen toward me. There was my electronic signature. The date was 11 months earlier, except I hadn't even been in the city that day. I had been in Boston for my company's annual conference. I still had hotel records. I still had the flight confirmation. I stared at my own name. The signature looked real. Of course it did. Caleb had access to plenty of samples of my electronic signature. We had signed property documents together, insurance forms, tax paperwork. I looked at the bank manager. What happens if I didn't sign this? His expression changed immediately. An hour later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. Her name was Naomi Walsh. A coworker had recommended her. She did not ask, "Do you still love him?" She did not say, "Maybe you two should try talking first," she asked. "Are you certain this signature is not yours?" "Yes. Does your husband know any of your banking security codes?"
He used to.
Okay. Change everything today. That was the day I learned something. A relationship problem and a financial problem are not always separate. Once someone gets comfortable making emotional decisions for you, it can become easier for them to make financial decisions for you too. I changed every password, removed his access from cards tied only to my income, redirected my paycheck to an individual account, and requested a freeze on additional HELOC withdrawals. Naomi gave me very clear instructions. Do not take money that isn't legally yours. Do not destroy anything. Do not threaten him. Do not send emotional essays over text. Save everything. Document everything. Protect yourself. I did exactly that. That afternoon, Megan texted me. "If you're willing, I think we need to talk again." At first, I didn't want to. Then she sent another message. "I just found out today that your house may have paid the down payment on mine." 2 hours later, we were sitting in the back corner of a coffee shop. No child. No Caleb. Megan had brought a folder. She got straight to the point. She had bought her house a little more than 2 years earlier. The down payment was $65,000. Caleb told her the money came from selling company stock. He told her the house would eventually become their real family home. Once the divorce was finished, he would move in. Whose name is on the property? Mine. Caleb isn't on the deed? No. She gave a bitter laugh. He said that way you couldn't take it during the divorce. The irony was almost unbelievable. My husband had borrowed against the home he shared with his wife to help another woman buy a house, then told that woman his name needed to stay off the property so his wife couldn't take it. He had created a separate story for every person. And in each story, someone else was the threat. Megan showed me her bank records. The timing matched perfectly. 3 days after Caleb withdrew $45,000 from our HELOC, he transferred $45,000 into her down payment account, then $19,000. That matched too. The rest had gone toward renovations and furniture. I wasn't even angry anymore. It was too absurd. That money wasn't his. Megan lowered her head. I know that now. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I'll cooperate with your lawyer. Why? She looked at me. Because I know I made bad choices. I knew he was married. I'm not going to pretend I was innocent. But I never agreed to let him use your home to buy mine. And I never agreed to make you responsible for debt you knew nothing about. That was the first moment I saw her differently. I still didn't like her. I wasn't going to become her friend. But adulthood isn't a simple world of good people and bad people. Megan had done something wrong. She could still decide at some point to stop participating in something worse. We started comparing Caleb's business trips. I opened our family calendar. Megan opened her photos. February 8, Caleb told me he was in Seattle. He was actually at Mia's school music performance. March 14, he said Atlanta. Dad breakfast. April 22, a client meeting had supposedly run long. He had taken Mia to the dentist. Then we reached my birthday from the year before. Caleb didn't get home until 10 at night. He claimed his flight had been delayed. Megan had a photo on her phone. 7:12 p.m., Caleb sitting at her dining table. Mia had a cake in front of her. It was a celebration dinner after a school competition. I didn't know it was your birthday, Megan said immediately. I believed her. Because Caleb's greatest skill had been deleting one world from the other. Near the end of the conversation, Megan asked, Do you know about Diane? Diane was Caleb's mother, my mother-in-law. Of course I know Diane. The look on Megan's face told me there was another surprise coming. Diane knows Mia. I didn't speak. How long? Around 4 years? It felt like someone hit me in the chest. 4 years. Every Christmas Diane came to our home. She sat at our table, and she would ask, Are you two really sure you don't want to try for children again? Once, she held my hand. I always wanted to be a grandmother. I felt guilty. I actually cried. She hugged me. It's okay, sweetheart. Meanwhile, there was already a little girl somewhere calling her Grandma Diane. I called her. The moment she heard my voice, she didn't pretend. She just sighed. So you found out. That hurt more than an excuse. When did you know? When Mia was about 2. Caleb told you? Yes. You met her? Yes. How many times? She didn't answer. How many times, Diane? Evelyn, she's a child. There it was again. The child is innocent. The child needs her father. The child needs her grandmother. All true. But why did every true statement somehow become proof that I deserved to be lied to? Mia is innocent, I know that. But why didn't you tell me? Diane was quiet. Finally, Caleb said he would handle it himself. He said you had been emotionally fragile. He said after the miscarriage, anything involving children was especially hard for you. I started crying immediately. Not just from sadness, from disgust. He had turned one of the most painful things that ever happened to me into a reason other people should keep lying to me. You sat in my house every year and asked me if I wanted children. Diane started crying too. I didn't know what to do. Yes, you did. You chose the option that was easiest for your son. I ended the call. Then I blocked her number for a while. That evening, Caleb came back again. This time I let him in. Not because I had changed my mind. Naomi told me to keep useful communication documented. He looked like he had aged years in a few days. The first thing he said was, My mom called. So now you know how much I know. He nodded. Evelyn, I really never planned for everything to turn into this. I pulled out the HELOC documents. This didn't just turn into this. You did this. My signature. My house. $84,000. How do you explain that? His face went pale. I was going to put the money back. When? When I got my year-end bonus? All 84,000? I have stock. Then why didn't you sell your stock to pay for Megan's house? He had no answer, because the answer was obvious. He didn't want to spend his money. He wanted to keep his investments, his marriage, his second family, and his freedom to choose later. Everybody else could absorb the cost. What did you actually want, Caleb? He started crying. I don't know. No. I shook my head. You knew exactly what you wanted. You wanted stability here, this house, this marriage, the normal life everyone thought you had. And you wanted what you had with Megan, too. You wanted Mia. You wanted the place where somebody called you dad. You didn't want to choose, so you made 2 women pay the price for your refusal to choose. He looked up. I love you. Those words used to soften me. Not anymore. Which version of me? He stared at me. The one who packed your suitcases, the one who helped your mother, the one who believed every business trip, or the one whose house you could borrow against without asking the actual person who owned it. He had nothing. Naomi will contact you. I'm filing for divorce. Caleb suddenly stood. You can't end 9 years over one thing. I stared at him. One thing? Caleb, Mia is 6. This isn't one thing. This is more than 2,000 mornings, more than 2,000 nights, hundreds of lies, dozens of fake business trips, one forged signature. $84,000 in debt, and 4 years of silence from your mother. You just put all of that into one sentence and called it one thing. He slowly sat back down. That was the first moment I think he began to understand the size of what he had done, not fully understand it, but at least see it. The divorce was harder than I expected. Not because I wanted him back. Because after 9 years with someone, your habits don't know where to go when the person disappears. In the morning, I still made 2 cups of coffee without thinking. I reached for the unscented laundry detergent he preferred. Whenever I heard footsteps outside the front door at night, I still looked up. During the first week, I even put a box of his favorite cereal into my shopping cart. Then I remembered. I stood in the cereal aisle staring at that box. And suddenly I started crying. No dramatic music. No one cared. An older woman beside me was choosing oatmeal. A kid was arguing with his mother about chocolate cereal. The world did not care that my marriage had ended. Eventually, I put Caleb's cereal back. Then I bought the kind I had always liked. The one he used to say was too sweet. The next morning I ate it slowly. It sounds small, but it felt like something. During the second month, another person entered the story. Naomi hired a fraud investigator named Owen Mercer. He was 36. He used to work in bank risk management. Now he specialized in identity authorization disputes and lending fraud. The first time we met, he did not say, "Your husband sounds terrible." He didn't act overly sympathetic, he just asked, "What outcome do you want? To prove the signature isn't mine? Then, to get that debt off my responsibility? Then?" I looked at him. "Divorce," he nodded. "Good." Clear goals at the time. I thought he was a little cold later. I learned that when your life is chaotic, a person who doesn't rush to define your emotions for you can be incredibly comforting. Owen traced the IP address used to submit my signature. It did not come from our home. It came from Caleb's office. Even worse, my phone had been in Boston that night. But the bank's 2-factor approval had been completed from a different device. The device matched Caleb's old iPad model. The evidence kept building. Naomi told me this might go beyond a divorce financial dispute. It could be fraud. I didn't feel excited. I just felt tired. One day Naomi asked, "Do you want to report this?" I sat there for a long time. "I don't know." "That's okay. You don't have to decide today." Caleb had spent years deciding things for me. Now people were willing to let me decide for myself. Even that felt unfamiliar. In the end, the bank opened its own formal investigation. A forged authorization from a co-owner affected the validity of the loan. That was when Caleb truly got scared. He started messaging me every day, not asking me to take him back, begging me not to send him to prison. Reading those messages hurt because this was still a man I had shared 9 years with. He wasn't a stranger. He had once slept on a hospital chair for 3 nights when my father was sick. When I had a fever, he went out after midnight to buy medicine. We had raised an old dog together. When that dog died, Caleb held me while we both cried for hours. That is what makes some betrayals so difficult. The person who hurts you was not evil every second of your life. If they had been horrible from the beginning, leaving would be easy. What makes it painful is knowing they really did love you once. You really were happy. And then, over time, they made too many choices that no longer deserved your love. I did not stop the investigation. I also did not ask anyone to punish him more than the law required. I told Naomi, "Let the normal process happen." That was when I finally understood something. Not rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices is not the same as destroying them. I did not need revenge, but I also did not need to protect Caleb from what he had done. During the 3rd month, Megan contacted me again. She said Caleb kept showing up at her house. She allowed him to see Mia according to a set schedule, but she refused to restart their relationship. Caleb couldn't understand. He asked her, "You waited for me all these years. Now I'm actually single. Why don't you want me?" Megan gave a small, tired laugh when she told me what she said to him. For years I thought you didn't choose me because you couldn't leave your marriage. Now I know you never chose anybody. You just kept choosing whatever life was easiest for you. I remembered that sentence for a long time. Caleb had managed to have 2 women in his life. In the end, both of us realized the person he had protected most was himself. Then Diane came to see me. She waited outside my office building with a paper bag. Inside was lemon cake. My favorite. Diane always brought food when she wanted to apologize. I used to find it comforting that day. It just felt familiar. We sat in a coffee shop. She cried almost the entire time. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said Mia was such a sweet child. Once she met her, she couldn't just ignore her. I never asked you not to love Mia. I asked why you didn't tell me. When you watched me grieve because I didn't have a child, what were you thinking? Diane stared down at the table. I thought telling you would destroy you. No, you weren't afraid of destroying me. You were afraid of destroying Caleb's life. She cried harder, and for the first time I didn't comfort her. That was one of the biggest changes in me. In the past, if somebody near me started crying, I would immediately forget why I was hurt. I didn't do that anymore. A person can be upset and still be responsible for what they did. Both things can be true. 5 months after everything started, the bank confirmed that my electronic signature had been used without authorization. The HELOC liability was restructured. Caleb became responsible for most of the disputed debt. He had to sell part of his personal investment portfolio to repay it. The divorce negotiations sped up after that. At first, he wanted to fight over the house. Eventually, he stopped. You keep it? He said. For a second, I almost asked. You think you're giving it to me? I already owned half of it, but I didn't. I was becoming less interested in winning every sentence. When you truly leave someone, many arguments stop mattering. The divorce became final on an ordinary weekday. No rain. No dramatic music. At 11:26 in the morning, Naomi emailed me. Final decree entered. I was downstairs from my office buying coffee. The barista asked, Name? Evelyn Hart. Then I froze. Hart was my maiden name. It was the first time since the divorce that I had said it naturally. When the drink was ready, the cup said, Evelyn, no Monroe. I took my coffee outside and sat in the sunlight. I didn't cry, I just felt lighter. Caleb later faced both civil and criminal investigation over the loan authorization. He did not go to prison. He accepted responsibility. He paid fines. He reimbursed some of the costs. He received probation-style supervision and financial monitoring. His employer also learned that he had used company equipment to submit false banking authorization. He lost his regional management position. He went back to a regular sales role. His income dropped significantly. When I heard about it, I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I used to think karma would feel satisfying. In reality, the real ending came when I could hear news about him and think, oh, then continue with my day. Megan sold the house too. No court forced her. She voluntarily cooperated in resolving the disputed down payment. She used the money that was legally hers to rent a smaller place. Mia stayed at the same school. Caleb remained her father. I never wanted to take that from her. Mia had done nothing wrong. A child should not become the punishment for adults' lies. About 8 months after the divorce, I ran into Owen again. The investigation had been over for a long time. It wasn't work. We were both at a community charity run organized by mutual friends. I almost didn't recognize him. He was wearing running shorts. Every other time I had seen him, he wore a suit. I looked at him. So you do have legs? He stared at me for a second, then laughed. I thought you didn't have a sense of humor during the investigation. I was getting divorced. Fair. We got coffee after the event. For the first time, we talked about things that had nothing to do with banks, loans, fraud, or Caleb. I learned Owen had been divorced too. No cheating, no scandal, no dramatic betrayal. He and his ex-wife simply started wanting completely different lives. She wanted to move to Europe. He didn't. They tried for 2 years. Eventually, they ended things peacefully. He said something I liked. Sometimes a relationship can fail without anyone needing to be the villain. I had spent the previous year surrounded by labels: wife, mistress, cheater, victim, good person, bad person. But real life is more complicated. People are built from choices. Caleb didn't destroy our marriage because men are terrible. He destroyed it because for 7 straight years, he repeatedly chose dishonesty. Owen wasn't automatically better just because he was a new man in my life. What mattered was how someone behaved during ordinary moments. My relationship with Owen developed slowly. After our first official date, he asked, "How often do you want to see each other?" I laughed. "People actually ask that?" "Sure. I don't want to assume." I remembered those words. I don't want to assume. Caleb's biggest problem had always been assumption. He assumed I would accept things. He assumed Megan would keep waiting. He assumed Mia would never understand what was happening. He assumed Diane would keep his secret. He assumed he could repay the money later. He assumed everybody would continue cooperating, Owen asked. "Do you want to go? Does that bother you? Do you want some time alone today? Do you want me to come over?" None of those questions sounded dramatic. No roses, no surprise trip to Paris, no standing in the rain screaming that he loved me. But the older I got, the more I understood that safe love doesn't need constant drama to prove itself. A year later, I got promoted. My company had actually offered me a chance to compete for the same position 3 years earlier. I turned it down. The role required travel twice a month. Caleb told me, "We can't both be gone all the time," so I stayed. Looking back, that was almost funny. The man who said, "Someone has to be home," had another home waiting for him somewhere else. This time, when the company asked, I said yes. After my first business trip in the new role, Owen picked me up at the airport. I got into the car. Tired? Very. Food or straight home? Home? 10 minutes later, I suddenly said, "I want fried chicken." He immediately took the next exit. He didn't say, "You just said you wanted to go home." He didn't act annoyed. He just smiled. Fried chicken it is. It was such a small thing, and for some reason I wanted to cry. For years I thought the price of love was this. Someone always has to adjust. Someone always has to be more mature. Someone has to need less. Now I knew better. Love does require compromise, but compromise is not the same as disappearing. You can change plans for two people, but one person's plans should not always be the only ones that matter. Owen and I had been together for 2 years when he proposed, not at a restaurant, no photographer hiding somewhere. We had just come home from the grocery store. 2 bags were sitting on the kitchen floor. One bag tore. 3 oranges rolled across the room. I was crouched down picking them up when Owen said, "I need to ask you something. Help me pick up the oranges first." "Can't wait." Then he pulled a ring from his pocket. I stared at him. "You've been carrying that around? For 3 weeks. Why today?" He thought about it. "Because earlier, you stood in the cereal aisle for 5 minutes trying to choose one." I laughed. He didn't know about that old memory. I had never told him that during the first week of my divorce I had once stood in a cereal aisle crying over Caleb's favorite box. Owen continued, and suddenly I thought, I want a lot more days like this with you. Buying groceries, arguing about who forgot laundry detergent, sleeping late on Saturday. You coming home from a trip and suddenly deciding you want fried chicken? That sounds good enough to me. Then he asked, "Would you marry me?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was unsure. For 1 second, I remembered my first wedding 9 years earlier. Back then, I thought marriage was built on one sentence. "I love you." Now I knew the difficult part was everything that came after thousands of ordinary days. Will you respect someone when nobody is watching? Will you tell the truth when lying would be easier? When a more convenient option appears, will you still remember your promises? Will you let your partner participate in her own life instead of making decisions for her? I looked at Owen. Yes, our wedding was small. Family, friends, my mother sat in the front row. Naomi came too. During her toast, she said, "The first sentence Evelyn ever said to me was, 'My husband forged my signature.'" Everybody laughed. I laughed too. By then it almost sounded like something that had happened to someone else after the wedding. Someone asked me, "What if the school nurse had never called you by mistake?" I've thought about that. What if Caleb had answered his phone that afternoon? What if Mia hadn't fallen? What if I had never gone to that school? Maybe I would have lived that life another year. 2 years. 5 years. I would have kept leaving Caleb's suitcase by the door. Kept buying his coffee. Kept smiling when people asked why we didn't have kids. We're happy the way we are. I would have continued believing our marriage had simply become quiet. Sometimes the truth appears and feels like it has destroyed your life. Later, you realize it may have only destroyed a life that was never completely real. Your real life begins after the truth. It took me a long time to understand that my 9 years with Caleb were not completely wasted. Those years taught me something important. Loving someone should never mean handing them control of your judgment. Trust is not. I never ask questions. Real trust is, I can ask. You will answer. We can talk. We can disagree. Neither of us has to lie just to keep the relationship alive, and there's something else I learned. A lot of women believe that when another woman appears, they have to win. If the man eventually comes back to you, then you won. I don't believe that anymore. Megan was never someone I needed to defeat. She made bad choices. I'm not going to pretend she didn't. But in the end, the person who harmed both of us most was the man who spent years refusing to accept the consequences of choosing. If a man has to choose you between two women, sometimes that question itself tells you that you should choose yourself first. Years later, Megan sent me a picture. It was Mia's 8th birthday. She was smiling in front of a cake. Caleb was there too. They had developed a stable co-parenting arrangement. Megan never got back together with him. Caleb never remarried. Everyone in the picture stood naturally. I looked at it for a moment. Then I sent a small heart. That was all. I didn't need to hate a child. I didn't need to spend the rest of my life hating another woman. Maybe one day I didn't even need to hate Caleb. Forgiveness does not mean you can come back. Sometimes you can forgive someone and the door still stays closed. That isn't cruelty. That's a boundary. One night after Owen and I were married, he had to travel for work. At 11, I got a text. Just landed. I'll text you again when I get to the hotel. I stared at my phone. For 1 second, I was back in my old marriage. Caleb had sent messages exactly like that. My heart started beating faster. My mind immediately went there. Is he really at the airport? Is he really going to a hotel? Is there something else I don't know? I sat there for about a minute. Then I called Owen. He answered. The airport was loud behind him. What's wrong? Nothing exactly. I just suddenly feel a little anxious. He didn't laugh. He didn't say, "Why are you still not over your past?" He said, "I get it." Then he turned the camera around. Airport luggage, people waiting in line. Then the camera came back to him. Want to stay on the phone until I get in the car? Yes, so we talked for 10 minutes. Nothing important. Later I told him, "You didn't have to prove anything to me." I know. But if it helps you feel a little safer right now, that's okay. That was the moment I really understood that I was living in a completely different kind of relationship. Healthy love doesn't demand that you hurry up and become normal again. It doesn't say, "Forget what happened. Stop being scared. Prove that you trust me." It gives you some time. And it doesn't use your old wounds against you. It helps you learn how to trust again, not by asking you to close your eyes, but by showing you, you can keep your eyes open and still love me. If someone asks me now what the biggest cost of everything was, it wasn't the $84,000. It wasn't the house. It wasn't even the 9 years. The biggest cost was that, in trying to preserve the appearance of a marriage, I slowly became a woman who stopped asking questions. Caleb said, "Work, I didn't ask. Business trip, I didn't ask." Later, I stopped asking again. I called that trust, but part of it was fear. I was afraid the answer might change my life. Then an elementary school nurse called me one afternoon. A 6-year-old girl sat outside the office. She looked up and asked, "Is Daddy coming?" That sentence ended my marriage, but looking back now, it also saved me. Mia didn't save me. Naomi didn't save me. Owen didn't save me. They all helped. But the person who really pulled me out of that life was the version of me who finally stopped saying, "Maybe I'm overthinking this," and started asking, "What is actually happening?" So if you're in a relationship right now and something keeps feeling wrong but the other person always tells you you're overthinking, you're too sensitive. I'm just busy. We'll talk later. I'm not telling you that you have to leave, and I'm not telling you to become suspicious of everyone you love. I'm saying this. Don't give up your right to know the truth just because you're afraid the truth might cost you the relationship. A healthy relationship can survive questions, and it can survive honest answers. Someone who truly loves you does not need you to know less in order to keep loving them. I used to think good love meant two people never disappointed each other. I don't believe that anymore. People make mistakes. People get selfish. People say the wrong thing. People fail each other sometimes. Good love is what happens after the problem appears. Both people are willing to face it. Not one person creating the damage while the other person is expected to understand it. That isn't love. That's exhaustion. Caleb cost me a marriage, but in the end, I did not lose myself. I took back my name, my career, my money, my judgment, and eventually I learned how to love again. Only this time, I wasn't going to do it with my eyes closed. Because now I understand something. The best kind of love isn't, I'll trust you no matter what. It's, I can see the whole person you are. You allow me to be my whole self, too. And with our eyes open, we still choose each other. That is the price I'm willing to pay for love now. Anything more expensive than that, I'm not buying anymore.